His father was a civil engineer, so it was not surprising that he would pick a field like architecture. He was very interested in that too. Then after that, he went off to Cornell University and got his master's in architecture from Cornell University. And after that, came back to Ahmedabad, came back to India and settled down in Ahmedabad, where he practiced architecture starting from the early 60s right up to the 2005-06. The last project presented in the book is from 2003, but it was completed in 2006. He continues to live in Ahmedabad. He's also my father, for those of you who don't know. Hasmukh Bhai's other role, besides that of a practicing architect, is that of a teacher. He started teaching architecture since the early 60s, first at MS University, and then the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad had just been started, and so almost from the second or third year of its starting, he was teaching there. Then from 72 to 82, for 10 years, he headed the School of Architecture, so very, very important sort of head of the School of Architecture. Then after that, he also headed CEPT University for a period of, I think, 6 years. And so that was a long tenure at CEPT University. So that sort of gives the basic biodata about Hasmukh Bhai. Hasmukh Bhai did many projects, and I'll let Catherine explain a little bit about how the projects are organized in the book.
Okay, so the first thing that we encountered when researching this book were very few published sources on Hasmukh Bhai's work. Despite the fact that he's one of India's best-known modern architects, there was very little publication. So we took a primary sources approach. We had full access to Hasmukh Bhai's archive of drawings. Unfortunately not of office records, but we did have all of the drawings. And we conducted extensive conversations with Hasmukh Bhai on each of these projects. So this book is a primary source document. Just to tell you a little bit about the structure of the book, the first thing that we noticed when looking through Hasmukh Bhai's archive was the huge variety of projects. Everything from private houses to schools, offices, apartment buildings, work for developers, for institutions, for private clients, all bearing a consistent approach, a designer's approach, which is quite rare to find, particularly in commercial buildings. So our first major decision was to separate the book into building types. So there are 12 building types in the book. We have houses, schools, offices and mixed-use developments, row houses, apartments, hostels, banks, educational institutions, religious institutions, theatres and auditoriums, stadiums, and urban development. So you can see the huge reach of Hasmukh Bhai's work in building modern India. Within each of those chapters, we've examined one building in depth with extensive plans, photographs, and writing based on Hasmukh Bhai's recollections, as well as architectural analysis. And then we show very briefly a series of comparative projects to trace how Hasmukh Bhai's ideas developed or changed as time went on and he dealt with these different building types. Then that, as Bimal said, is complemented by the academic essays at the end of the book and the introduction, which analyze Hasmukh Bhai's work. Thank you.
I've been coming to Ahmedabad for more than 15 years, and I've been staying in Ahmedabad for the last 3 years. So whenever I come to Ahmedabad, there are 4 things in the following order that fascinates me. One is CEPT, second is Corbusier's building, and third is a few of Doshi's building, and fourth has always been the Patang restaurant, and the revolving one was really an iconic thing. I still remember, I don't know if some of you may remember the 1990s, early 90s, late 80s edition on Ahmedabad by Architecture Plus Design. carried the Patang restaurant and not any other iconic building in Ahmedabad, you know. So you always used to wonder who this architect was. I was a very young architecture student when I first came, a third-year student. So I was told it was Ahmed Bhai. And then I figured out the neighbor, which was the RBI building, which had an impressive facade from the other side of the river, was also by him. And then you walk into the old city, you would see this shoebox-like thing, the Dina Bank, which was also quite an impressive building. And then I figured out there were many such buildings which Ahmed Bhai had done. And I was quite surprised, even as an young architect, there was not much written about him, while other couple of famous architects were well known. So after almost 2 decades, a good monograph has come, and I first compliment both Bimal and Catherine. And I really admire not only the voluminous thing, but first of all, I really commend the quality of production. I mean, as an architect, it is impossible not to appreciate the object simultaneously as much as the content. So it's extremely well produced, and particularly the drawings are exquisitely done. And I haven't seen in the recent years, when I keep track of many of these publications, I do book reviews, etc., but I haven't seen anything as well produced in terms of drawings as this. So I first compliment both of them for really taking the effort, and particularly for architects whom this book more appeals. This would be a very important thing to understand, you know, how the architect has designed, etc. So I would want to first congratulate and compliment you for producing this wonderful book. I'll make a couple of observations, and then I'll open it up for the audience to comment, make an observation, question, do whatever you feel like. So we'll have a nice conversation for 30 or 40 minutes from now on. My first observation is that the first thing that strikes me after going through these projects is the variety. There's a tremendous amount of variety, because I know very famous architects in India and abroad who are either doing mostly museums, institutions, and they don't dirty their hands doing commercial buildings, etc., which is good. There's personal choice, etc. But it's quite impressive thing about Ahmed Bhai is there's a wide variety of projects. And two, it's a prolific practice. It's not just 10 projects in 30 years or something. There's a phenomenal amount of projects. I'm sure both the authors had a problem of plenty, how to choose. So even 53 would have been a tough choice to make, and I can really understand that. So the first thing that strikes me, as I told you, is the variety. And variety is not only in terms of houses and so on, but also the kind of things that he has done. One looks bare to me, you know, very simplest. I won't say simplistic, very simple, but another looks very complicated with the shapes. Some look flat without any ornamentation. Another looks with sloped roof with little more of ornamentation. Some look diagonally organized, some look orthogonally organized. There's an amazing range of solutions that he has used. So the one that it strikes me is, whenever you travel in India in different cities looking for modern architecture, look at a facade, you can say, okay, that's Doshi, that's Korea, this is Kanvinde. I mean, you can easily spot. At least if you're an architect, it's easy to spot. But then I think it's a bit difficult to do with it with Ashma. There is no signature style, correct? So, I mean, one can read this both as a compliment and as well as, you know, as what is this architect doing? He's not branding, he's not predetermining himself. So, the question that, it looks like probably Ahmed Bhai had a set of solutions which he innovated, improvised based on the context and condition, without any predetermination of what style and solution he is going to use. Now, this is, at one level, is a compliment, but the question to you, Bimal, is, in today's context, repetition is not really valued much, correct? So an architect is expected to produce always something new, novel, a signature style is more welcome. So how do you read this kind of an approach which does not privilege novelty in the design? As an architect practicing for more than 2 decades.
Well, there's 2 things I could say about what you're saying. While, if you look at Ahmed Bhai's projects, they are all in the book. Each one of them is different, but there's also a strong common aspect to all of them in the attitude that he has towards the problem solving. All of his buildings in some ways have something common, but that common is more at, what is common is more at the level of the attitude to the project, to the work, rather than just in terms of style. So that is, there is a continuity. I don't entirely agree with you that it's all very different. But let me, you asked a question about today. Everybody, we put a lot of emphasis on innovation, and we want, everybody wants something different. They don't want the same thing over and over again. Now, to me, that's this attitude to innovation is a bit of a problem. And when architects start wanting to innovate and do something new every time for the sake of doing something new, then it's a problem. I tend to think of architects as professionals, and I think Hasmukh Bhai also thought of himself as a professional, and a professional in the sense of an engineer or a doctor or a, that sort of a professional, who, when they find that some solution works, they don't try to unnecessarily innovate. Imagine a doctor who finds that a particular medicine works, but for the sake of innovation, the doctor says, let's try some different medicine this time. So that would be irresponsible in some sense. When he utilized similar solutions every time, perhaps that is where that was coming from. I don't know if that answers what your question was, but...
Yeah, in fact, there's an essay by Bobby Desai towards the end where he makes that point. He says, Hasmukh Bhai would not, go for a new solution unless a substantial benefit is, proved. And so, in a sense, that kind of echoes what you're saying. But I was just wondering, normally the opinion amongst people is engineers build building, architects build architecture. So, these practical ones are left to the engineers, but the artistic ones are left to the architects. But I think Hasmukh Bhai kind of challenges that notion. You see, you're doing, it is both. Of course, I personally don't make any distinction between buildings and architecture. Both of them are of great value. But nevertheless, Hasmukh Bhai seems to be reconciling that fact that you could be artistic in a way too, but you could also be practical, and as you rightly said, a professional would do all of that. So it's something good about this, the kind of building, the selection of projects that you have made here. Catherine, my next comment is requesting you to respond to what I have to say. Yes, Hasmukh Bhai has done a lot of important buildings, good buildings, and so on and so forth. But I don't think till your book was published, he got the attention that he actually deserves. Partly because the 60s and 70s, where he was practicing at its prime, had a certain kind of modern look. It was flat, it was barren, etc. So people normally thought that these are not to be, showcased as a great accomplishment of Indian architecture. So they were, particularly the 60s and 70s building, even in contemporary history of modern architecture, doesn't find great amount of recognition. So what I didn't find in the book, but probably in this conversation that you could say, is that how would you locate Hasmukh Bhai in the larger context of what is happening in India, and particularly the kind of architecture that he advocated or practiced?
So it's a very good question, I think, and it gets quite to the heart of perhaps a larger misunderstanding about the architecture of the 1960s and 1970s. I think in the decades following this work, we told quite singular stories about the history of modern architecture, including very specific ways of looking at buildings. And I think this is probably true also of the story we told about international modernism. It had particular qualities, it had particular masters, and from these things flowed the work of everybody else. And I think that this is probably a flawed way of looking at the history. The idea that all this work flowed from a tabula rasa moment in India, either independence or perhaps the arrival of Corbusier in a city like Ahmedabad or in Chandigarh. And I think, taking my cue from the research I conducted with Hasmukh Bhai while writing this book, he made it absolutely clear that whatever impression later generations had formed, and for myself it was formed by reading the books that were written largely during the 1980s, he made it clear that his generation had a broad interwoven tapestry of influence. And I'd just like to tell you two of the projects that he mentioned as being influential during his education. He mentioned being taken to see Claude Batley's Ahmedabad Town Hall and being particularly impressed by the quality of brickwork, the exposed brick panels, which contrast quite strongly with the approach that Corbusier later brought to India, which celebrated the rough qualities of found materials. And the second building he mentioned was a Tira, which he went to see by Kanvinde, which he went to see when he was also a student in Baroda, which shows that he's half a generation, 5, perhaps 10 years younger than Kanvinde, but already this generation was being influenced by Indian architects as well as by the architects who came from abroad. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it partly does answer the question, but I think what it requires, my observation of history of modern architecture in India has not been adequately probed, because it is either it is shown as an imitation of Corbusier and Kahn, or it is shown as a rejectionist of that. But I think people like Hasmukh Bhai and many others in, for example, the exhibition that we curated earlier on Talati, were actually contextualizing these ideas, because India was always open to new ideas. And in fact, what strikes me in the history of Hasmukh Bhai, that when he came back, he didn't choose to work with any modern architect, so to speak, but with Atmaram Gajja, who has built the Gujarat University, the HL Commerce, then Town Hall, which was more kind of a very regional motives, very much visible in the face. But then he eventually chose to do something of his own. But I'm sure a good architect and observant that Hasmukh Bhai was, I'm sure he would have responded to some of these things. But have you had any conversation about that period when he practiced here?
So, see, I grew up in Ahmedabad, son of Hasmukh Bhai, and I was studying at Sept University. But even there, the sort of general impression one formed about the history of modern architecture in India was as if in India everything was darkness, and then, or everything was tradition and old, till two great masters came from the West. One was Corbusier and the other was Kahn. They come here and they brought the light with them, and then started modern architecture in India. This is the sort of, nobody told us this, but from all the different things that one read and talked about, the few things that one read and many things that got talked about, the general narrative was that first there was sort of tradition, and then these two gods came from abroad, and then everything else, and then modern architecture started. Now, when we were looking at Hasmukh Bhai's work, we found some of his student projects from 1950s, mid-50s, done at MS University in Baroda. Then a few months ago, I also saw the exhibition curated by Professor Srivatsan about the work of Arvind Talati, who is also an Ahmedabad-based architect, who also, I think, was trained at JJ and also in the early 50s. Their student work is also visible. When you see the student work, it is clear from the 50s, it is very clear that the student projects where students are in some sense inspired, where are they taking their inspiration from? What are they seeing? Well, they are doing quite, what you would call modern architecture already in the 50s. So this is long before the arrival of Kahn and Corbusier in some sense. And they are already, so the influence of Western architecture, undoubtedly this came from the West. The sort of modern architecture, it came from the West. But nonetheless, it far preceded the sort of arrival of the great masters and their building here. So Indian architects were looking at the developments in the West quite actively and sort of looking for things long before the masters arrived here. So in that sense, there is a problem. We have really not written the history of modern architecture in India in a proper way. And Kaivan Mehta, who is head of, who is also a historian and works in Mumbai, recently made a talk and said that actually it's through the publication of monographs such as Hasmukh Bai's, and there have been many in the last couple of years. It's through such slow accumulation of monographs that we will be rewriting the history of modern architecture in India. And in many ways, when we were doing this work, it was to celebrate Hasmukh Bai's work, but it was also meant to contribute to this larger project of celebrating modern architecture in India in a slightly different way than it has been earlier. So that's what I would say.
Probably we'll wrap this point with an observation that I like to make. So when I came to Ahmedabad and I wanted to read the history of modern architecture in Ahmedabad, I couldn't see any than a work on Doshi or on Anantaraje. But the phenomenal amount of people who really made Ahmedabad a capital of modern architecture of India. In fact, the axis of architectural invention is Delhi, Bombay, Ahmedabad. But the amount of work produced on architects in Ahmedabad, and I'm sure there are equally good architects, very good architects in Baroda and Surat, hardly any. So in that sense, I think it's a very good, commendable work by putting together the works of Hasmukh Bai. I'll move to the third part, the next point, which is the clients and patronage. I find going through the various projects, looks how Hasmukh Bai had three major clients. One was the Jesuits, second was the banks, and third was the university people. So, and probably Catherine, I would ask you to say something about the kind of clientele you work. And they look, all these clients actually demanded good buildings out of Hasmukh Bai. It looks particularly the description more in detail about the Newman's Hall, which is my favorite, and the Dina Bank, where the involvement of the client is described a bit. So there is a certain contribution of the client also in producing the good buildings that we now see here. Do you want to say something about that before?
I think that Hasmukh Bai was probably quite unique in that he had a very inclusive approach to design, not only in the way he organized his office, where at team meetings, suggestions, he of course is the principle of the practice, but it was quite an open attitude. I think a very open discussion happening, which was quite different to the guru and disciple way in which many modern architectural practices were organized. And I think he carried this open, generous, collaborative spirit through into his relationships with clients and with contractors, with the people who were making the buildings, and with the consultants. And I think this, I see it as stemming partly from Hasmukh Bai's personality and upbringing, which Bimal can talk more about, but also from his education at Cornell. And I'd like to read you from the book just a brief description from the prospectus of Cornell when Hasmukh Bai joined. It says, "The program in architecture is purely professional and objective, and only for those who are seriously interested in professional careers in architecture should make application for admission. The courses of study recognize the dependence of the profession of architecture not only upon technical skill, but also upon a cultivated taste and a creative imagination. They emphasize the architect's obligation to society as well as to the client. The architect today must be a person of many talents. He must be an artist and an engineer, an administrator and a coordinator of the work of experts in many fields. Above all, he should have a broad understanding of fundamental human values and problems. And I think that these principles, so ingrained in Hasmukhbhai's practice, he was able to transmute to a variety of clients. So you see a great consistency of approach between a domestic house for, be it a middle-class family or an industrialist later on, or a commercial client or an institutional client. He rolled out these values in his approach to designing these buildings, which meant that he kept an extreme grasp on cost, which of course was great for developers, but was also great for private clients. And because he had this skill, he was able then to think of giving something more, but always within the scope of the brief. That was never going beyond what would be beneficial for his client. So I think this is one of the reasons, and I'll pass over to Bimal to continue, but this is one of the reasons that Hasmukhbhai was able to make architecture for so many different clients and to contribute to so many phases of the development of Ahmedabad in particular.
Bimal, there is a general view that clients come in between good design and architect. Two, that in the modern times, unlike in the 60s and 70s, where there was a demand for good design was wider, currently the constituency for good design has shrunk, and the demand for value for profit and value for design are irreconcilable. Either you can have this or that. These are the popular perceptions about contemporary architectural profession scene. So how would you react to that?
So when somebody, the relationship between the architect and the client is very different from the relationship between, with other professionals and clients, and even between an artist and a patron. The relationship between an architect and a client can be of three types. There are some clients who prefer to work with an architect who they can order around. You see, the client tells the architect, I want it this way, why don't you just draw it up like this and give it to me? In such cases, the client is looking, you know what the client, that patron, that person is looking for. He's looking for, if the building turns out nice, then he goes around telling everybody, my architect didn't do anything, I did it. If it turns out bad, then he has somebody to blame, and he doesn't have to blame himself. So there are some clients who prefer architects who will do whatever they are told to do. And there are also some architects who are willing to get into such a relationship with a client. They're willing to say, "Abhe client ne જોઈએ છે, do it." In Gujarati માં કહે ને કે રાજા ને ગમી તે રાણી, એટલે જે client કહે તે કરી નાખવાનું. That is one relationship that's possible. There is another type of a relationship, જેની અંદર the architect wants to be the boss, and the architect wants to be able to order the client around. Many architects like to be in such a situation. They say કે આપણે જો જોઈતું કરી ના શકીએ તો એનો ફાયદો શું છે? We should be like a great artist, we should be able to order the client around. Now, there are many architects like that, and they want to be in such a powerful position that they can, whatever they design is built by the client, unquestioningly accepted by the client. There are clients also like that who are willing to accept such architects. They are often insecure people themselves, and they want the architect's name to give themselves some legitimacy. They use the architect to get some prestige for themselves. You know, there are people who wear clothes and they wear them even if the clothes are uncomfortable. They will say, so and so fashion designer has designed it, you know. So that is the situation, the second type of relation. But there's a third type of relationship which I think is very interesting, and that is really perhaps the most productive one. At least I like to believe that it's a relationship where the client and architect consider each other to be somewhat equal. It can never be 100% equal. It's, after all, it's the client's money. And the client has the right to throw you out. You don't have the right to throw him out, in a sense. You know, after he throws you out, you can always say that I threw him out. But the fact is that he will get another architect. You will not get another building, that same building to build. So that relationship is never 100% equal. It's always a little bit unequal. And yet, both people know that they need each other. The architect cannot, function, cannot make a living, let us say, without having the job of the client. And the client knows that he needs the skills of the architect. The project is defined by the client. And the architect has nothing but his own persuasive powers to convince the client. So it's a collaborative relationship. You know, when people ask me whether where else is there such a collaborative relationship? Well, it's a little bit like Akbar and Birbal. You know, between the two of them, it is very clear that Akbar is the emperor and he is the more powerful of the two. But Birbal uses his tongue, his language and his persuasive powers to convince the king what to do. And really, a good architect and a client relationship can be like this, between Akbar and Birbal, in a sense, where you know both of you need each other. You know it's slightly unequal, but it's a mutually respectful relationship where you work like this. So I think that relationship, that sort of client is available even today. I don't think the patronage structure has changed that much. There is no much difference between the past and now. What has changed is perhaps the number of people who want to be in the first type of relationship or the second type of relationship or the third type of relationship. That's what my feeling is.
We can continue with the conversation, but I thought probably I'll just open it up to the floor and then we can probably come back if we have the time and we are still up to it. So if there is a comment, observation, a question to ask, please feel free. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you. And first of all, sir, I'm a big fan of your architecture. And though I'm not an architecture student, but I must say that whenever you walk into the building designed by HCP, or when you touch the wall built by you, you can feel the sense, or you can feel the aura, right? The kind of hard work and the values you have put and the kind of vision you bring, because as important for you to design a building, it's also important you to solve the problems. Like you just say that it has to be a problem solving in nature. Though you are a professional, but every professional, you actually bring or define the value of professional in a different ways by designing the building. If I say that if you would like to portray Ahmedabad in the modern architecture way, then you can never portray without the projects built by HCP or without the work you have done. So that is much more important for us to learn from you as a professional, though we are in the different field. But as for us, it's always moment of proud to be in such a city that which brings a lot of value in terms of architecture. And here my value, or my question is that if you want to narrate a couple of your projects, like which are the most important or which are the most complex projects you have ever built, so which kind of two projects you would like to narrate?
Yeah, I'll take a few more questions before we respond. please.
My question is to Bimal bhai. Suppose I can say HCP architect Hasmukh Patel is a ustad of HCP Gharana. So you are an extension of that Gharana, or you have created your own way, your own differences. I want to know your process.
Okay, there are a few more hands behind, so we'll take a couple of questions together.
This is a slightly different question, nothing to do with HCP. I mean, we are in an age of disruptive technology.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Hello? Yeah, we are in an age of disruptive technology, and I think other than HCP, you are part of SEP, which is a very important. So, what I just want to understand is that how is the teaching, or probably the way architecture is taught, because I think architecture is going to change, if not today, probably in the next 10 years, in how we build, how we design. So what are the steps as CEP as a university or as HCP as a design firm is taking to kind of inculcate that ideologies and that philosophies?
Okay, one more we'll take and we'll put all the four together. Okay, you can, till the answer you can think about the question. Now, I think the first question is a big compliment, we'll accept it. But Bimal, that talking about your personal projects, we'll hold it back, we'll focus on Bimal, I'm sorry about that. But that second question is quite an interesting question. Is there any Hasmukh Bhai Gharana, is there something like that? And do you have it? Catherine, you too can respond on the Gharana question. It's a school. It's a school, it's a style. Yeah, it's like, is there an Hasmukh Bhai tradition? It's a Gharana.
Well, I think that that if we look at, well, I certainly consider myself a disciple of Hasmukh Bhai's sort of way of doing things, and I'm in many ways extending, strongly rooted in the tradition that he has established, and very, very much think of myself as extending it rather than doing something completely new. So for me, that's an answer straight away. I would like to extend that a little bit, and I do think that actually if you go around in the city and look and ask the architects of the city, I think perhaps you will get an answer that there are many people who have directly or indirectly been influenced by the approach and attitude of Hasmukh Bhai, either as students or as people who have worked in his office, because it's a big office that has formed many traditions, and many people who would say that they have taken on those traditions and are inspired by it and want to work within those traditions. So I think if one looked at it, definitely one would find a sort of a school of Hasmukh Bhai's way of doing things. Yes, so I'll stop at that. And
Catherine, you want something?
Yeah, I just add, building on what you said, Bimal, that Rahul Malhotra's essay in the book, in this essay, he speaks about how influential Hasmukh Bhai was for his generation, particularly in terms of his commercial work. And he puts it very succinctly and very nicely. He says that Hasmukh Bhai, for his generation, redefined what could be done in the mainstream, the commercial work principally he was referring to. And he said that if you can't affect the mainstream, you can't affect society. And I think that these lessons have percolated through the generation who followed Hasmukh Bhai. But as you say, Bimal, it would be very interesting to speak to Ahmedabad's architects on this point.
No, I think that essay by Rahul Malhotra, and also connecting with what Bimal you say, really if you were to follow Hasmukh Bhai, it's to be professional, there to be context, and that's possibly the Gharana. But the far more important point is what Rahul makes, that Hasmukh Bhai was able to work in the mainstream projects and make an impact on that, which is quite an important contribution. And I think that looking at your own projects, which we can of course talk in another meeting when you publish your book, is also more on the mainstream kind of a thing. Now, we'll take the last question I understand is about the role of technology and how far or how much less or more compared to the previous decades as HCP as a firm has embraced technology or CEPT as an institution has embraced technology.
I think if I'm correct, your question was more about how do you educate an architect and what you do to train an architect. And once again, if I want to, I'd like to put it in sort of as, I'd like to give the education of an architect, when you teach somebody how to design, teaching design is not like teaching, for example, chemistry. If you teach chemistry, then to make a chemist, a scientist who is studying chemistry productive, first you have to give the person lots of information. You have to fill the person up with lots of data, lots of information. So most of the education to start with is lecture based, and you give lots of, you have to master lots of facts before you can become productive. Architecture design is not like that. Okay. Architectural design is also not like mathematics. Teaching somebody doing mathematics. Mathematics, you have to start with some simple, learn some simple operations, and then slowly you can do some more complex operations. So you learn arithmetic, and then you learn trigonometry, and after that you can learn calculus, and so on and so forth. You build up from one base to another. So it's not like that either. You don't need a sort of sequential approach to problem solving. Actually, learning design is a little bit like learning driving. There's only one way you can do it, which is, you don't give them a theory course before teaching somebody driving. You just tell them, get into the car and start driving, And it's a little more complicated than learning driving, but it's pretty much like that also, because you have to take the car around for 15 days, and practically everybody in the world can learn how to do that. Now, I don't think everybody can learn design, but the dimension, the teaching is somewhat like that. So, teaching an architect, you have to, you tell the person, okay, come along, let's start solving problems. Now, much like driving, you don't tell the person, today we'll learn brake, tomorrow accelerator, third day we will learn, how to do the clutch. You have to start everything together. And you tackle the problem. On the first day, your car doesn't go around. You take a long time to make one chakkar and come back. But by the 15th day, you have learned how to do that fairly well. And then you can drive more or less any type of car that you want to drive. So learning design is pretty much like that. You take a student through iterations. It is like learning how to do factorization, for those of you who have been, who remember that from mathematics class. You just got to keep doing it a number of times. I don't think much is going to change in the years ahead, because you don't learn specifics. Even if the world is changing, technology is changing, and materials are changing, you don't hope to teach a student everything about all the materials. Or you don't teach them about, you teach them an attitude to problem solving. And that is what a good school tries to do, which is why even though the world is changing fast, the sort of education, the pedagogic style, in a sense, need not change that much, if that's an answer to your question.
Now we have to excuse Catherine. She has to leave and join her daughter's birthday. She's already late. So Catherine, thanks for joining us, and have a good evening with your daughter, and convey our birthday wishes to her.
Thank you very much for inviting me today and for the interview, both of you. It was very enjoyable. I'm sorry that I can't stay for the rest of the questions. It's sure to be interesting, the conclusion of the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. We'll take a couple of more questions, and then we have to wrap up. So if there are any more. Thanks, Catherine. So anyone wants to make a comment, an observation? Okay, I think that's a good, and probably we may also wrap up here, and probably help the organizers catch up with their lost time also. So, Bimal, again, let me compliment you and Catherine for producing this a lovely book, and I quite commend the attention paid to the publication. It's got a good collection of buildings, and I'm sure monographs like this, which you also mentioned, over a period of time, maybe if not history of modern architecture in India, certainly history of modern architecture in Ahmedabad needs to be first written. And I think works like this around individual architects could somehow contribute and make a meaningful history of Ahmedabad, which will be of great local interest and national interest. You want to say something?
Yeah, at the end. That's
Okay. So I'm quite happy this book has come, and I'm sure you've been planning and working on it for almost 8-9 years now. And that hard work and commitment is quite evident in this book. Congratulations again, and I hope this book finds many buyers and readers. The publisher Mappin is here, which is also an Ahmedabad-based publisher, known well for the architecture and art books. I want to congratulate Bipin also for producing this wonderful book. And with your comment, we can wrap up. Bipin.
Yeah, no, you said exactly what I wanted to say. Products, the making of, when this book was made, I realized that the making of books is as much, it's a project like making a building. Many things have to come together, and somebody has to guide that process and take it all the way through. It requires a lot of passion, requires a lot of love, and it's in some ways a thankless task. So I wanted to really point out the fact that if the book has come out well, then we must really thank Bipin Bhai, who is in the audience there. He is the publisher. Mappin after making the book, I realized that what a tremendous contribution Mappin and Bipin Bhai have made in producing terrific books about art, architecture, and culture. So a round of applause, I think, is warranted. Here's an Ahmedabad-based publishing house doing terrific work that we are doing. Thank you, Bipin Bhai, for all the support.
Well, I would just like to conclude the session. Thank you so much, sir, once again for the insightful journey to the city of Ahmedabad, as well as Hasmukh sir's journey. It was a different perspective, different view to look at and hear the stories. Can we please have a round of applause for both of them, as well as Catherine, who is not here. I hope it was an interesting session, and I think sir will be available in the next door, so you can ask your questions over there. Apologies, as we are running a little late on time for the next session, and we have the audience for the next session also. We cannot take up the questions. Thank you so much, and we'll start the session in next 2 minutes. We'll just take a breather for 2 minutes. All those who want to attend other sessions, and all those who want to come and be part of the next session, we'll just take a break for 2 minutes. Thank you so much. Thank you.